The Lone Star State. Known for such wonders like the Johnson Space Center in Houston, the San Antonio River Walk, and that beaver-themed gas station the size of a Walmart, Texas is an absolutely massive state with almost 30 million people and a land area over 695,000 kilometers squared. This makes it a bigger area than any single European country alone, and with a wide variety of cities all over the state, let's have some fun putting the cities into a tier list based off of an urbanist perspective. Now, similar to all the other videos in this series, I'm going to be pulling walk score for my data. It isn't the most absolutely perfect way at looking at cities, but it's a solid way of quantifying data on transit, cycling, and walking. I'll also be pulling data on city rents as part of the score, like my last video, and the same goes for ranking the vibes of these cities. You can absolutely flame me for how I rank the cities based off vibes, but please do so respectfully in the comments below. Also, I need to make this clear, but this tier list is just amongst the cities on this list. If a city gets an A on this list, that doesn't mean that it would get an A on another list, because spoiler alert, most Texas cities aren't great urbanist hubs. But anyways, let's get into the list. Also, side note, I'm adding Oklahoma cities to the list. I didn't want to put them in the Midwest or Southern city tier lists, so now for real, let's get into it. The capital of the state, Austin doesn't quite have the crazy sprawl like some of the larger cities in the state. However, it is still full of car-dependent city design that Texas is well known for. Wide freeways in the downtown area, and ample parking, whether surface, parking garages, or underground parking. However, things aren't all bad in the city of Austin. The city actually has been doing a lot in terms of zoning by upzoning a lot of the city's downtown surface lots and building more mixed-use zoning. The city also has some transit. It mostly uses buses, but there is the Caprail Metro. It only currently runs one hybrid rail line carrying service from downtown Austin to Pflugerville. It's pretty infrequent and doesn't run on weekends, but hopefully that can change in its future. I know Austin's had some expansion plans, but we'll see how that goes. Austin definitely has some momentum for improving the planning of the city, and overall from everything I've seen about Austin, it does seem like a very enjoyable city. The main issue with Austin is rent. It's the highest average rent out of any city on this list, and it definitely hurts its rating. And to live in Austin's walkable neighborhoods, you're definitely going to be paying just a little bit more than you would outside of that. Austin is doing good, but it has a long way to go, and even by Texas cities, it's going in the C tier. Let's go over 550 miles away to the western end of Texas to El Paso, a city that's surprisingly good for Texas standards. One thing I've noticed is that, like a lot of border cities, El Paso maintained a decent amount of the mixed-use walkable city planning. Most of these nice walkable neighborhoods generally are around the downtown area, but outside of that, like pretty much every other American city, it becomes a lot more car dependent. El Paso has some downtown streetcars, which are old PCCs retrofitted with modern pantographs, which honestly looks super cool, and a bus system that's better than expected for a city of El Paso's size. But one thing that really carries El Paso in this rankings is its rent. It's incredibly affordable to live here, with an average rent being under $1,000. And even in cities with more walkable neighborhoods, it's still around this price point. And with some interesting vibes with it being a border town, El Paso definitely punches above its weight for cities of its size in Texas, but it still ends up being in the C tier. The fourth largest city in the country, Houston often gets a lot of flack in the urbanist community for things like the Katy Freeway, and deservedly so. However, that doesn't mean that all of Houston is awful in terms of its city planning. The city is actually served by multiple frequent bus routes, which were praised for their reorganization that promoted ridership a couple years ago, and they also have 3 light rail lines in the city. Houston is doing a bit to build more protected bike infrastructure mainly around the core of the city, in some of its most walkable neighborhoods. In terms of walkability and transit, there is a lot of momentum in the city to actually improve it, but like Austin, it still has a long way to go and suffers from its downtown freeways. Houston actually has some pretty reasonable rent too, especially for a city of its size. It does get a little more expensive in the walkable and transit-oriented neighborhoods, but hey, they're in short supply, and people want to live there. In terms of the vibes, I gave it a pretty high score. It's a very multicultural city with plenty to do, and it definitely has a lot going for it compared to most other Texas cities. It only gets a 9 though, because Houston summers are brutal, and that's probably an understatement. Despite all of its flaws, Houston is on the way towards improvement, and it's gonna go in the B tier. When I was thinking of concepts for this series, one of the questions that came up was, what region am I going to put the Oklahoma cities into for a tier list? And personally, I think it fits nicely in a Texas City tier list. And why not start off with none other than Oklahoma City itself? Now, OKC really isn't known for its urbanism, and yeah, those numbers don't look very good. I think the most telling thing is the 17 for transit. I mean, that's like embarrassingly low for a metro area with only 1.4 million residents. That's growing pretty fast. The cycling and transit scores really aren't that much better. The city does have a downtown streetcar and one frequent bus line, along with some less frequent ones, but that's about it. The true saving grace of Oklahoma City is rent. It's some of the lowest in the country, and with rent that low, I can see why people would choose to live here. In terms of the vibes, I'm gonna give it a lower score. It does have some stuff to do, but compared with other cities like Houston or San Antonio, it pales in comparison. Also, tornadoes. Lots and lots of tornadoes. All being said, Kansas City is bad, but the rent really saves it from being F tier. But you know what does belong in the F tier? Is hearing me talk about my Patreon. Because if you joined it, you not only wouldn't have to hear me interrupt the video, but you'd get to hear about 3 more cities, see my videos earlier, get your name in the credits, and more. If you want to check it out, the link is down below. But anyways, let's get back into the list. Home to one of the coolest pedestrian areas in America with the San Antonio Riverwalk. Outside of this, however, the planning around San Antonio is unfortunately in line with a lot of the other Texas cities. San Antonio actually does have a surprisingly good bus network with express buses and late night buses. And while San Antonio doesn't have true BRT, it does have signal priority on some of the routes as well as bus lanes. Still, much of San Antonio suffers from the car-dependent sprawl that's amplified in Texas cities, and it's no different here. Rent in San Antonio kind of rides towards the upper middle end for Texas cities. It is fairly reasonable, and San Antonio definitely has things to do and enjoy from its status as being a bit of a touristy city. Definitely not the worst, but definitely not the best. San Antonio is going in the C tier. Dallas is surprisingly only the 3rd largest city in Texas. However, that doesn't make it a small city. It's part of the largest metro area in the state, and some of the other cities in the metro area do show up later on this list. But Dallas is definitely the best city in this metro area when it comes to urbanism and city planning. Although the scores don't look super impressive, Dallas Area Rapid Transit, or DART for short, runs a pretty comprehensive bus and light rail transit system in the city of Dallas and some of its suburbs. The city also has a connection to Fort Worth via Trinity Rail Express, which operates a heavy rail service. The city also has a streetcar, but it really isn't super frequent. However, it does add to the city's transit network. The city does suffer from a lot of the same issues as other Texas cities. You know, downtown freeways and endless sprawl. Especially the second part for Dallas. The metro area is insanely massive. Rent in Dallas, though, is pretty high by Texas standards, but this is the center of Texas's largest metro area, so it's understandable. A lot of the neighborhoods around downtown are pretty walkable and transit accessible, but there's a pretty steep drop-off outside of it. The city at least has a lot to do in it, with museums, bars, restaurants, parks, and a strong sports culture. I'm going to put Dallas into the B tier. Heading over to the other side of the DFW metro area is the city of Fort Worth. It definitely doesn't have the same advantages as Dallas, as a lot more of the walkable core got gutted in the 20th century. The city still has rail service from TRE and TexRail, which operates modern DMUs between downtown Fort Worth and DFW Airport. Rent is a little bit more reasonable here in Fort Worth than it is in Dallas, but it's still higher than the Texas standards. And in terms of the vibes, it kind of just feels kind of empty compared to Dallas. But hey, at least it's easy to get to Dallas. But Fort Worth is going in the F tier. Laredo is a border town, and as a result, really didn't see as much urban freeway development, so much of the old city blocks still exists. Much of the core of the city still remains with walkability, and also has some bike lanes installed. The city has a pretty standard walk and bike score for a city the size of itself in Texas, but more interestingly, the city didn't have a transit score, so I did some digging on transit in Laredo. Laredo does have a pretty standard bus service, and that wasn't hard to find data on. I think it's more or less just a shortcoming of walk walk score, but I'm gonna give it a pretty basic transit score since it's mostly just standard bus services. Rent here is pretty reasonable at a little over $900 a month, and the vibes are definitely more alive than other cities on this list, but it doesn't have the amenities of a larger city. Overall, I'm gonna throw Laredo into the D tier. For being the largest city in America with no public transit, Arlington gets a special award. And finally, we have what was once the richest city in all of Texas. Galveston is a port city on a barrier island near Houston, and with it being an older city in Texas, it retains a lot of that old grid and narrow streets. The city easily scores the highest walking and biking score out of any city on the list. Now, transit for Galveston is a weird one. Like Laredo, it doesn't show up on walk score, but the city does have transit, with bus routes that run all over the island, as well as a streetcar that connects the main part of downtown Galveston to the beaches. So for that, I'm going to give it 25 points since it actually has just a little bit of rail transit. The city actually doesn't have crazy high rent like many beach communities. This might be due to its proneness to flood, but regardless, it's not crazy expensive. In terms of the vibes of Galveston, to me, a beach town gets extra points, and it has parks, museums, and plenty of entertainment locations generated by the tourism. It does, however, lose points for its flood proneness and its humid weather, but the vibes are generally good. But with the highest total score for any of my Texas cities, I'm going to give it the W for the Texas city tier list and put it on the A tier of this list. So here's a recap of all the cities that I ranked. How do you feel about this list? Was there anything you'd like to add or change onto it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Here's a thank you to everybody who helped me make this video. And here's a very special thank you to all of my patrons, especially CC Marv MD, who's in my trolleybus tier, and Tony Stunts, who's in my Metro tier. Want your name read out in the credits, access to videos early, extra content, and much more? Then go check out my Patreon. The link is down in the description. And while you're down there, also check out my other social medias, including Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, linked below. Thank you all for watching this video, and as always, I'll see y'all in the next one.